Hello, my name is Garshan Pro, and I've been Challenger since Set 2. Positioning is one of the most important aspects in TFT. You can a lot of times win fights that you otherwise wouldn't be able to with good positioning, and lose fights that you would otherwise win with poor positioning. In this video, I'll be going through how to position every single unit in Set 10. I'll first be starting with the 1 cost, moving on to the 2 costs, then the 3 cost, 4 costs, and finishing out with the 5 costs. All units will be timestamped in the description, and there should be chapters on the video as well, so you can skip around if you'd like to. So starting off, we have Annie. Now, Annie is a ranged carry unit, and generally we want to have our ranged carry units on either the back right corner or the back left corner. The reasoning for this is these corners are generally just going to be the safest hexes to have your carry in. They're going to be less susceptible to crowd control, because a lot of times crowd control comes down the middle, and you of course want them in the back row because they're going to be the safest this way. Now, Annie is a bit interesting because she has two main properties of her that kind of conflict with her positioning. The first is going to be the fact that Annie is a scaling champion. Scaling champions in general want to be opposite side of the enemy carry. The reasoning for this is, let's say the enemy carry is this Corki. Now, Corki's not a scaling champion. His damage at the start of the fight is basically the same as his damage at the end of the fight. And we have the Annie same side as the Corki. What's really likely to happen is that the Corki actually bursts through our front line that's directly in front of our Annie before our Annie can, because the Corki has more front-loaded damage than the Annie. The Corki bursts through that and then gets onto our Annie. If the Corki's attacking our Annie, like he walks up and starts attacking our Annie before our Annie's broken through the Corki's front line, the Annie player will usually just lose the fight, because once your carry is dead, you usually just end up losing the fight. Now, if the Annie, however, is on the opposite side, she can actually scale up throughout the fight because Annie's damage is backloaded, because once she does 4 casts, she's going to gain attack speed and she's going to be hitting an additional unit. So you have a bit more time for the Annie to scale up and actually get to the Corki. The reasoning being opposite side is a bit better when you have a scaling champion, is you're going to have additional backline units. Let's say it's like these Jinxes right here. If we're opposite side the Corki will have to get through these 3 Jinxes before it gets to the Annie, giving your Annie a bit more time. If you're same side as the Corki, however, the Corki will get to this Annie before these extra Jinxes right here, even if we put them next to the Annie. So yeah, generally speaking, you want to have your scaling champions on the opposite side of the enemy carry. That being said, Annie's a bit interesting in that after she does 4 casts, she's going to be hitting a second additional unit. What this means is actually in practice, you generally want to have your Annie on the same side as the enemy carry. Because let's say your opponent has like this Tahm Kench as their frontline unit right here, and has like their frontline spread out like this. There's actually a really high likelihood that the Annie will hit the additional unit being the Corki with her ult, because she hits an additional unit that's close to the enemy unit that she's hitting with the ult. So it's actually very likely she goes onto the Corki with the second part of her ultimate, and you can actually do a lot of damage to the enemy carry, potentially even snipe them if you have like good items on your Annie. You typically want to have Annie on same side as the enemy carry due to this. Of course, if Annie is not your carry unit, her positioning doesn't matter too much. What you generally want to be doing though, if Annie isn't your carry, in the early game at the very least, I would just put her next to whatever carry you have. Let's say this Nami is our carry. You generally just want the Annie to be directly next to the Nami. The reasoning for this is that Focus Fire is going to be king in the early game. Here's a good example. Let's say the opponent has these 2 Tahm Kenches right here, and let's just, for the sake of argument, say each of these Tahm Kenches has 1000 HP. Now, let's say my Annie and my Nami are positioned like this, and each of them does 500 damage. If my Annie and my Nami each do 500 damage, each of these Tahm Kenches will be half health. Now, if I move the Annie and the Nami right here, and they each do 500 damage, this Tahm Kench will die, leaving just this Tahm Kench alone. Now then they'll have to do another 1000 damage total to kill the second Tahm Kench. So it's the same amount of time to kill both Tahm Kenches either way. But the reason that you'd much prefer killing this Tahm Kench initially, and then kill the second Tahm Kench, is because the Tahm Kench, of course, is going to be doing damage. And if it's another frontliner, they might be ulting and all that stuff. You'd rather just kill it first, that way you're lowering the amount of damage that your team is taking. This is super important in the early game. You want to always make sure that your carry and your other backline units are next to each other in the early game to burst things down. I'll see people like position like their back units like this in the early game. I hate this because you would just get really, really poor focus fire if you do this. In the late game, focus fire isn't quite as important because your carry is going to be doing really, really strong burst damage anyways, so they generally don't need help getting through stuff. That being said, focus fire is nice late game, but you do want to make sure that your carry isn't getting crowd controlled in the late game, so you do see people spread out a bit more due to that fact. But in the early game, always want to make sure your units are focus firing down the same target. Next, we have Corki. Now, Corki is interesting because his ultimate is going to be hitting in a bit of an AoE around the units he's hitting. What this means is you don't want the enemy front line to be spread out because you want to be hitting multiple units. What this means is that if you're into a Corki player, you want to spread out your units. So let's say I'm into this Corki player and I have these 2 Jinxes and these 3 Tahm Kenches. What I'd ideally want to do is spread out these Tahm Kenches and spread out the Jinxes on the back line like so. That way, if the Corki ults, he's not hitting multiple of them. If, of course, these Jinxes are next to each other and the Corki, ends up killing through this Tahm Kench and getting onto this Jinx, when he ults, it'll hit both of them. If I have these Tahm Kenches next to each other like this, the Corki ult will hit both, which is going to be bad because you want to be mitigating the amount of damage the enemy's doing. If I'm the Corki player, I want the enemy to be clumped. What this means is I'm going to have to do a few tricks with positioning to try and guarantee a clump. If I spread out my front line like so, what's going to happen is these Tahm Kenches won't move, and the Corki is just going to be gunning them down one at a time. If, however, I move these Cassantes over to the right clumping like this second Tahm Kench will typically walk over to this Cassante like so. Now I'm going to go through and kill this Tahm Kench. When I ult this first Tahm Kench, I'm still only going to be hitting one unit, but now at least in this scenario, once I've killed this Tahm Kench, I'll focus fire onto this second Tahm Kench here, one of these two, and my ult onto those will of course hit the second one, meaning that at least a bit of my damage is going to be utilizing the AoE factor from his ultimate. If you want to fully greed this, you can actually just solo frontline unit. That way if they have 3 Tahm Kenches like this, what can be very likely is that they actually all just clump around your frontline unit like so. This won't always happen, but it's potential the units that the units walk up like so. Again, if you start like this, it's very high potential the units walk around like this. And you're actually able to, on the hit these 2 Tahm Kenches, you're going to hit this Tahm Kench and this one as well. And then after this guy dies, you're going to retarget onto one of these Tahm Kenches, and you're going to be hitting both of them with the ultimate as well. So that is an ideal way. Of course, you don't always want to have a solo frontline unit. You're losing a bit of value because these guys have to walk up before they can start auto-attacking stuff. Generally not ideal. I would really only recommend this if you know you have a really strong tanky unit that you want to be just taking all the focus fire. Something with like a Warmog Stoneplate. It's pretty good. If you just have like a normal frontliner, I recommend just putting everything on the front line to try and spread out the damage they're taking. Because like I talked about, you want to be able to focus fire their units, which means that you want to be able to spread out the damage that they're dealing to yours, which is why there's a big disadvantage to solo frontlining a unit early game, because they're going to be focus firing as a default. Whereas, if they have multiple units on the backline, let's say they have these 3 Jinxes right here, and I throw my 3 Cassantes in front of these Jinxes, it's very likely that each Jinx will be hitting a different Cassante, even though they put them next to each other, which is why I generally don't like solo frontline a Cassante like this, because then they're all going to be attacking the same unit, and you're losing that advantage of focus fire. Next we have Evelynn. Now Evelynn can be ran in one of 2 ways. You can either be using her as a melee carry in the early game, or you can be using your Evelynn as a trait bot in the late game. If you're using your Evelynn as a trait bot in the late game, she's going to have Crowd Diver, and with Crowd Diver units that you don't care about, you actually want to just throw them on the outside of your front line. The outside units on your front line are going to be the ones that are generally going to be hitting a hit first, and they're going to be taking that damage initially. Now, if you're just running like a random Evelynn 2 with no items in the late game, you actually want her to die at the start of the fight. That way you can immediately proc that Crowd Diver effect and CC the enemy carry. What this means is that, of course, you want the Evelynn on opposite side the enemy carry, because Crowd Divers always jump onto the farthest unit. So if the enemy Jinx is top right, you'd much prefer to have your Evelynn top left, because it's actually going to be a solid amount of CC onto the Jinx. I think it's like 1.5 seconds, which is actually quite significant. If, however, you're running your Evelynn as a melee carry in the early game, generally speaking with melee carries, you want to have them on the second row. That way they're not going to be getting hit first, but they also don't have to walk up too much. An important principle to keep in mind is that you pretty much always want to have your tankiest unit directly in front of your melee carry. Here's a good example. Let's say I have these 3 Tahm Kenches, and one of these Tahm Kenches is going to be 3 items, and the other ones are not going to have items. So actually, just to simplify this, I'll say these Olafs are less tanky than the Tahm Kench, because the Tahm Kench is one sitting here with like, Stoneplate, Bramble, Warmogs, etc. If I put this Evelynn next to this Olaf, and the enemy has a carry on the back row, let's say this Jinx, what'll happen is the Jinx will kill the Olaf, and then after it kills the Olaf, the Jinx is just going to retarget onto the Evelynn and kill the Evelynn. Of course, the same thing is going to happen if I put my Evelynn behind the Tahm Kench, but of course the Tahm Kench is going to die a lot later into the fight because it's a lot tankier, meaning that we get a lot more time before the Evelynn is going to get targeted and killed, which is going to be really beneficial if she's your primary source of damage. So always make sure your tankiest unit is directly in front of your melee carries in order to keep them alive as long as possible. Generally, whenever I'm positioning my melee carries, I like to just have them either in this far right or far left hex, because I find this just be safe. You leave one hex open on the sides like this, that way she can walk up right here. If your Evelynn is pretty strong and you feel pretty good about the amount of damage she can do, you think you can break through their front line pretty easily before they break through yours, you want to be same side as enemy carry. That way, while your Tahm Kench is still alive, your Evelynn can kill the enemy carry right here, enemy tank right here, and actually walk back onto the enemy carry. If you're doing this, I actually do recommend clumping your front line like so, and here's the reasoning. Let's say your enemy front line is these Cassantes, and they have their Cassantes like this. What's very likely is if you have your front line right here, they're going to be clumping around like this, and if your Evelynn walks up, kills this Cassante, there's actually a very good chance that the Tahm Kench walks right here and kind of body blocks this Evelynn. So instead of pathing over to this Cassante, she sees the closest unit is this Jinx, which in this scenario is the enemy carry. She's going to walk onto the Jinx and kill the Jinx. If you had your front line spread out, however, like so, what's going to happen is you're going to kill the Cassante, and you're not going to be able to like body block like I did in that positioning right here, and she's going to walk onto this Cassante, and then just get focus fired by the Jinx and die. So you generally want to have your front line clumped, that way you can potentially body block and walk onto the enemy carry. Now there are situations where the enemy carry is going to be a lot stronger than your carry, and you don't really feel that strong about your front line being able to sustain through it. If you feel a bit weaker than the enemy, and you're not sure that you're going to be able to live through being able to kill your first frontline unit before they kill your tank, what I actually recommend is just having your melee carry on opposite side of theirs. Reasoning for this is you're going to have a bit less upside. You're not going to be able to immediately walk onto the enemy carry, so you're going to be a lot more likely to lose the fight. But in this way, your carry is generally going to be getting hit the last because she's opposite side of their carry, so you're going to have all these units to body block for her, and your Evelynn's going to be able to do a lot more damage and potentially just save some HP by getting a few more kills. So if you're strong, same side enemy carry, weak, opposite side. So next we have Jinx. Now Jinx positioning isn't really that hard. Similar to Annie, she is a ramping backline carry, so you do want to have her on opposite side of the enemy carry if possible, but realistically, her positioning doesn't matter too much, so I wouldn't worry about it that much. Again, if she's your carry, you want to just have her in one of the corners generally. If she's just your like secondary damage source giving rapid fire to like an Aphelios or something, you just want her like one hex over, so like you have your Aphelios here. You typically just want your Jinx either here or here. That way she can focus fire with the Aphelios and do damage together. And then you'll typically not be running Jinx on your late game board, but if you are, you can just throw her wherever on your board. Kennen is a bit interesting because he's a Guardian, which has a bit of interesting positioning mechanics. And then he's actually also a 2-range frontliner. So the first thing is that if Kennen's going to be your tank, like he has that super fan with the Perfector's Vow, and you're going to run other items on him, you typically want to have the Kennen in the front line. A lot of times you might want to even solo frontline him. That way he's just guaranteed getting hit first. As a general principle, you also want your Guardians to be getting hit first. If you want your units to be getting hit first, you want them to be on the outside of your front line. The reason you want a Guardian unit to be getting hit first is basically this principle right here. Let's say we just have 3 units on our board. It's this Kennen, this Tahm Kench, and the Annie, and maybe it's like a chosen Guardian Kennen or something. That way he has the Guardian active. Now, I can either have the Tahm Kench die first, and then the Kennen dies, and then we pass the Guardian Shield to Annie, or we can have the Kennen get hit first, and then pass the Guardian Shield to the Tahm Kench. The reason that we want the Kennen to be dying before the Tahm Kench ideally is due to the fact that we'll be able to pass the Guardian Shield over to the Tahm Kench, keeping the Tahm Kench alive. You want to keep your front line alive as long as possible. Like I was talking about with the whole focus fire thing, the longer you can keep your frontliners alive, the more they're going to be able to do. Your Annie's going to be safe as long as your front line's alive, generally speaking. So, being able to pass that shield onto her isn't as big of a deal. You'd rather pass that shield onto the Tahm Kench, especially if the Tahm Kench has like items and is going to have extra resistances. And even not, you'd rather just have more units alive longer because the shield's going to have the same effect either way. So generally speaking, you do want to have your Guardian units being hit first, and especially in Kennen's case, if he's going to be carrying your items. Kennen also does have a bit of interesting positioning quirks in that he does CC, so he's going to do some single target CC, and then if he has true damage, he's actually going to be CCing 2 units. So again, you want to have your Kennen typically directly in front of your carry. The reasoning for this is due to a quirk with being able to CC the same unit that your carry is hitting. Now, here's the thing with CCing a frontline unit. Of course, if you're CCing a backline unit, you want to be CCing their carry because they're going to be doing the most damage. So if you CC that carry, you're going to be reducing the amount of damage they're doing. CCing a frontline unit inherently doesn't have that much value because they're generally just not doing much. Let's say your opponent has two frontliners right here. Actually, Tahm Kench is a bad example. Let's say they have like an Ekko right here. Now, let's say your Kennen is just going to CC this Ekko like so. Really, that's not a big deal. The Ekko's just going to sit there for like a second and a half, however long Kennen's CC is, and then afterwards, he'll just go back to doing his thing. Now, if you instead CC the Ekko when the Kennen is directly in front of your carry, here's what's happening. Your carry will be hitting the Ekko at the same time as your Kennen. A lot of times what will happen is the Ekko will be at full mana or near full mana when your Kennen ults. If the Kennen ults when the Ekko's near full mana, your carry will be doing damage to them and get the Ekko to full mana. But it doesn't matter that the Ekko's at full mana due to the fact that the Ekko is CC'd from the Kennen. He's not going to be able to gain mana while he's in that, he's not going to be able to gain mana because he's full mana, and he's not going to be able to ult because he's in that crowd control state, essentially meaning that he's wasting damage that he's taking. Because of course the Ekko really wants to be using all the damage he's taking to convert to mana, so if you can block some of that conversion, it's going to be more effective, which just means crowd controlling a unit directly in favor of carry as a default is going to be better. In addition, being able to crowd control enemies' crowd control is really impactful. If you can put your Kennen in front of whatever their crowd control is, it's going to be really good because if you can CC that unit, you can kind of stop them from CCing you until later. And being able to delay the CC can be nice because then again, you're front-loading your damage, which being able to front-load your damage will be a bit better than back-loading your damage. Getting CC'd later in the fight's better than getting CC'd earlier in the fight. In terms of getting the CC off from Kennen, as a default, I'll just put it in front of your carry for the reasons I just talked about. If they have a strong crowd control frontliner, you can put him in front of that instead. And if they have a melee carry, of course, you want to put the Kennen in front of that, so that way he can CC that unit. The other thing is Kennen is 2 range, so sometimes you do just want to have your Kennen on the second row. If the Kennen isn't your main tank, again, I'll still just typically throw him on the outside, that way he can give off the Guardian Shield. But if you're sitting here with like a really tanky frontline, you can actually just throw Kennen on second row to guarantee that he's not going to be dying first. Especially if you're sitting here with something like an itemized Taric 2, he's going to be a lot tankier than just some random Kennen on your board. So you can position something like this, that way the Taric will always die first. Keep your Kennen alive a little longer, because if the Kennen's squishy, you'd rather just your tankier unit to be getting hit first. Again, you generally want your tankiest unit to be getting hit first, because that way your other units will die later, and you'll be able to essentially have more uptime on your units being alive. Next, we have K'Sante. K'Sante, typically you want to be getting hit first due to the fact that his ultimate is going to be reducing damage taken. That's a big part of its power budget. So if you're not reducing damage taken, his ultimate's not doing that much. It actually does do a decent amount of damage. I think it does like 500 damage or something at 2-star. But even then, you typically want your K'Sante just to be getting hit first, especially if he's in like late game. A K'Sante late game isn't going to be doing that much. And even in early game, he, in terms of like Sentinel units, him and Mordekaiser are usually the ones you want on the outside. Now, the one case where you wouldn't want him on the outside is if you have something like a Redemption or a Sunfire. Redemption's really good to have in the middle of your 2 other units. That way you can give the redemption value to those other 2 units. And then Sunfire is really nice because that way if you have your Sunfire unit in the middle of your front line, they'll live a lot longer because again, the units on the outside get hit first. And you're going to be able to have more time to spread out that Sunfire. Middle's also better for Sunfire, of course, because if they have more units on the front row, let's say my K'Sante has Sunfire here, he'll be able to hit all these Tahm Kenches with the Sunfire. But if I had my K'Sante on the outside, he wouldn't be able to like hit this far Tahm Kench. So you're going to be lowering your value on that. Next, we have Lillia. Now, Lillia, of course, is going to be pairing with K'Sante. I said K'Sante typically wants to be on the outside. Lillia typically wants to be on the inside. She's going to hit in a bit of an AoE, so if you have to default her positioning, I like her on the inside. That way, again, if they have a bunch of units on the front line, she can hit all of those. And then, in addition to that, she isn't quite as tanky as something like K'Sante here, so having her in the middle is better because you want her to live a lot longer. A lot of times you will be playing Lillia with the KDA, though, so you'll typically just throw her on whatever frontline KDA hex you have. If you're itemizing your Lillia, like maybe you have like a 3 Superfan Lillia with the Adaptive Helm, maybe some like other tank items, solo frontline the Lillia is actually quite solid. If they have a bunch of frontline units like so, and you solo frontline the Lillia, they'll all clump around the Lillia, and she'll actually be able to hit all of them because she does a bit of an AoE with her ultimate, so you can kind of maximize the amount of your damage you're doing. So something like solo frontline in a KDA hex like this, I really like if I actually am itemizing my Lillia. Otherwise, I'll just throw her on the middle of what other frontline units I have. When it gets to like late game though, I don't really care that much about my Lillia positioning. If I'm using her as like a trait bot in like a KDA build, I'll just throw her on the outside of the front line. That way my real frontline units can live a lot longer. Your stuff like your Neeko or whatever. Lillia is not going to be doing really anything late game, so just throw her on the outside and let her just be kind of like a meat shield for your better units. Next we have Nami. So there's 2 cases with Nami. You're either running Nami as a support unit or you're running Nami as an early game carry. If you're running Nami as an early game carry, I typically just like to throw her in one of my corners here, have her items, that way she lives the longest around the disco ball. I'll talk about how to position disco ball at the end of this video. And if I'm running Nami as like a mid-game support unit next to another carry, I'll typically just throw whatever carry that is in the corner. So let's say you're carrying this Annie, I'll just throw the Nami directly next to the Annie like this. That way we can focus fire. Again, focus firing damage as well as crowd control like I've discussed earlier in this video. When it gets to late game, you would ideally like your Nami to be same side as your carry. That way you can crowd control whatever your carry's hitting. That being said, a lot of times you just don't have like the positioning budget for that. You want to be positioning stuff like a Lulu or whatever next to your Twisted Fate, so you don't really have the capability to get the Nami near that. And you don't want to like overclump your units. You have these disco balls and you're like trying to position around the disco ball and you kind of just run out of room. So I typically just kind of throw Nami in like the middle of nowhere away from the rest of my team. All my other units over here, I'll typically just throw her, not really care what she's doing because late game she doesn't do that much. Next we have Olaf. Now there's 2 cases with Olaf. The first case is you're running like an itemless Olaf or an Olaf with tank items. If you're running like an itemless Olaf, I'll typically throw him in the middle of my front line like so. Because you typically don't want Olaf to be the one getting hit first. You don't want him, he's not as tanky as like Gragas and Tahm Kench. So you'd rather those units be getting hit first, him getting hit second. So the middle is going to be best for that. If you're itemizing him with like tank items, you can actually consider though throwing him on the outside, because then you would want him to be getting hit first because you want your tankiest unit to be getting hit first. And if you're going to be putting like damage items on your Olaf, what you want to actually do is put Olaf on second row, just like I talked about with melee carry positioning with Evelynn. have him on second row, ideally on the same side as enemy carry. That way he can potentially walk back onto that enemy carry. Again, always just put your tankier unit here. So if it's like a Tahm Kench 2 and a Gragas 1, you want the Tahm Kench to be in front of the Olaf. But if it's like Gragas 2 and Tahm Kench 1, you want to position like this, just to protect your Olaf as long as possible and allow him to live a bit longer into the fight. If you're running Olaf as a carry in the late game, you can actually consider running like a 3-star 3-item Olaf on front row like this, because he actually does scale off the damage he's taken. So you do kind of want to be taking damage. I wouldn't ever put him on the outside of the front row though, because he's going to get bursted down too quickly. But you can actually put him in like the middle of the front line, especially if he has like a Quicksilver. That way he takes a bit of damage, because usually units on the front row will take a bit more damage than a unit on the outside like this. Potentially, get that bonus attack speed. I would really only do this though if I have a Quicksilver on my Olaf. Otherwise, you're just going to get crowd controlled by stuff like Thresh, and you'd rather just be on the outside like this on this second row. Next, we have Taric. Taric's going to be really common in your disco openers. I typically like to have my Taric be the first unit hit. Again, for 2 reasons. He's generally going to be your tankier unit. He gives a nice shield to himself, and so he's going to be a solid tanky unit. He's going to live a long time, especially if he has that disco healing him up. So again, you want your tankier unit to be getting hit first. And then in addition, he's a Guardian. You want Guardians to be getting hit first. That way they can pass off the Guardian shield to your other unit, just letting your other units live a bit longer. Next, we have Tahm Kench. Now, Tahm Kench is a super tanky unit in the early game. He's one of my favorite chosen units to play in the early game along with Taric. Super tanky, and you generally want your Tahm Kench to be the first unit hit. Tahm Kench's only goal is to be tanky. Again, he doesn't have an ultimate. He doesn't do anything besides be tanky. So he is 100% the definition of a unit you want to be getting hit first. You can just throw Tahm Kench on your outside. Now, of course, throwing a Tahm Kench on the outside has a disadvantage in the fact that if the enemy carry is on the opposite side of the Tahm Kench, he won't be getting hit first. If you want to get around this, if you're sitting here with like a Tahm Kench 2, I recommend actually positioning potentially something like this. That way, you're very likely for your Tahm Kench to be getting hit first, no matter where the enemy carry is, and you have that correct focus fire in the early game. If you have something like a stone plate on your Tahm Kench, you actually want to throw your Tahm Kench back like this. Sorry, Tahm Kench forward like this, your other units back like this. That way you can guarantee that all their team is focus firing the Tahm Kench immediately, and he gets a ton of stone plate value. The scenarios where I wouldn't do this is if he's sitting here again with a Sunfire or Redemption. You want to just have him in the middle for aforementioned reasons. Next, we have Vi. Now, Vi is actually not that tanky of a unit. There's nothing about her ult that makes her tankier. Mosher does make her a bit tankier in that she can heal from it, but really it's not as much as other units that have actual tanky properties to their ultimate. So you typically want to have your Vi in the middle of your front line, usually like so. Now, Vi does have a couple other parts about her kit that make her interesting positioning-wise. First off, she has single target CC. So again, you ideally want to have that same side as your carry as a default. Otherwise, you want to have it in front of the enemy melee carry if they have one. And then she also provides armor shred whenever she ults, which means that, again, you want to have her directly in front of your carry. That way they're hitting the same unit. So I like positioning something like this with my Vi. That way we can just get that armor shred onto the same unit, because a lot of the time here they will, the Jinx and the Vi will actually be hitting the same unit. If you positioned your Vi in the middle like so, they wouldn't be hitting the same unit. Whereas if you position like this, they actually will be hitting the same unit. It is possible that your enemy clumps their stuff together like this. Here the Jinx is hitting the far right Tahm Kench and the Vi won't be. In this case, you can move your Vi to the outside like this. It's a little less than ideal because, like I said, you don't want the Vi to be on the outside because she's not that tanky. But being able to get off that immediate armor shred might be nice. So you can definitely consider doing something like this if the enemy frontline is positioned like so. Finally, for the 1 cost, we have Yasuo. Now, Yasuo, of course, a melee carry, meaning you typically just want him be either on the far right or the far left of the second row, just to keep him a bit safer. And then ideally, you always want to have your Yasuo on same side as the enemy carry. Reasoning for this is, of course, like we said earlier, with melee carries, you want to have it on same side as enemy carry. That way they can potentially walk into the carry. But especially with Yasuo, due to the fact that he's an edgelord, it's just really, really likely that he can dash, edgelord dash on behind and onto the enemy carry. For instance, if my opponent's Tahm Kenches are positioned like this, my Yasuo walks up, hits this Tahm Kench, and he might edgelord dash behind this Tahm Kench and actually just decide to path onto this Corki right here. What this means is if I'm the Corki player, you always want to make sure that you have your front line clumped together. If I simply just clump like this with the Corki as the Corki player, the Yasuo will dash behind this Tahm Kench, and then we'll just start hitting these other Tahm Kenches in the front line, meaning it's a lot more likely that my Corki is staying safe. Of course, the Corki player can also just move these Tahm Kenches over to the left, and it's even more likely that the Corki stays safe. But if you're playing into a Yasuo, make sure you have your front line clumped together and not spread out, because once you spread out your front line and the Yasuo dashes behind, he's just going to walk onto the back line. Even if your carry is on the opposite side, let's say here the Corki is the carry and the Annie's not, right? And the Corki's on opposite side of this Annie, and opposite side the Yasuo. You'd think the Corki is safe because he's opposite side the Yasuo, but what can happen here is the Yasuo hits this Tahm Kench, dashes back, kills the Tahm Kench, walks into this Annie, and now he's just sitting on the backline, and then he just decides to start like walking across your backline, especially if you have multiple backline units. If you have both these Annies right here, the Yasuo will hit this Annie, kill the Annie, walk over, hit this Annie, kill the Annie, and then walk onto the carry while ignoring this front line. So you're just going to have a much better time if you have the front line clumped for this versus the Yasuo. That way, whenever he dashes behind one of them, he's always going to be next to another frontliner, and you can keep your backline nice and safe. Moving on to the 2 costs, we first have Aphelios. Now, if you're like carrying your Aphelios in the mid game or even in the late game if he's a 3-star Aphelios, you generally just want to default to having him in the corner, again, because it's the safest. One note that I did forget to mention earlier is that generally speaking, if I'm going to default, I prefer right side for my ranged carries, just because I find this hex to be a little bit safer than the left side hex, because it's obviously like one back here, whereas the left side hex is kind of forward, so it's a bit closer to everything. Really not that big of a deal though at the end of the day, but if you're going to like not scout, I do recommend just putting it on the right side. That being said, if Aphelios is not your carry, let's say you're carrying like the Caitlyn here, you typically actually want the Aphelios to be close-ish to the Caitlyn, but kind of in the middle. The reason for this is that if Aphelios gets a kill with his ultimate, he actually does AoE CC, which is like relatively significant. So you actually want it to be closest to the carry, that way he actually can like kill the unit he's hitting, because if you just have a no item Aphelios 2 sitting in the middle of nowhere, he's not going to be killing anything late game. So you do need it like next to your carry, that way there's actually a chance that he can get the kill and get that extra CC, and then you kind of want it middle-ish, because that way he can, CC a larger area. Moving on, next we have Bard. The healing portion of Bard's ult just always hits the lowest health ally, so your positioning for that doesn't really matter. If you're not carrying the Bard, his positioning really doesn't matter. His damage is like pretty negligible. He's pretty much a trait bot most of the time. If you are carrying the Bard, again, usually just put him in one of the corners, but usually Bard positioning doesn't matter that much. Garen positioning, he's actually like decent mid-game. He gets decently tanky and does a decent amount of damage, so it is kind of nice to have him in the middle. Typically, you'd want something like the Cassante or, the Mordekaiser to be on the outside. That way he's in the middle of them, because he's going to be doing a bit more damage. Because you want him to be able to ult a couple extra times too, because he does damage every time he ults. It's a decent amount of damage in the mid game, and then he gains HP every time he ults as well. So the longer he lives, the tankier he becomes. So generally, you just want the Garen to be in the middle, so that way he's not the first unit dead. In the late game, however, I kind of just throw Garen wherever. Kind of just goes in whatever empty slot I have, because a lot of the late game units you want to position in certain places to like get full value out of their ultimates. That being said, if I have to just default him to somewhere, I would just throw him on one of the outsides of the front line, because he doesn't really do anything late game anyways. He's kind of just a trait bot. Kind of just throw him onto the outsides. Next, we have Gnar. If you're not running Gnar as a carry, I would generally just frontline the Gnar. Anywhere on the front line doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter whether he's targeted first or last. Usually just like the middle-ish, because usually there's other units you'd rather get hit first, but it really doesn't matter. You can throw him wherever on the front line. He'll typically just ult, get a bit of HP, and make your team slightly tankier. That being said, if you're carrying the Gnar, he's generally going to be headliner. You should only be carrying Gnar if you're headliner usually. And if you're carrying the Gnar, what's common is to second row the Gnar and just have other units on the front row. So in this case, like let's say these Cassantes, he's going to insta ult if he's a headliner Gnar, and so he'll jump behind the enemy front line. Like if the enemy has these Lillias as the front line, he'll ult behind them and just start hitting them like this. You can try and put Gnar same side as enemy carry, that way he potentially walks back into them. Again, if, for instance, you're playing into a Gnar, I do recommend clumping your front line a bit. If you're going to declump your front line like so, what the Gnar player can do is have the Gnar jump like behind this unit and then potentially walk onto the enemy carry like so. Here the Gnar can very easily just walk straight over to this Corki. He's 1 hex away from this extra Lillia and 1 hex away from the Corki, so he'll just 50-50 as to which one he targets onto. However, if the Lillia player just has them all next to each other like this, the Gnar kills this, then, it's going to be more likely that he targets onto this Lillia right here. Then here it's a 50-50 between this Lillia and this Corki, but you've stalled a bit more. So you do want to clump your front line if possible against Gnar, so that way he's not going to like jump onto a unit and then just walk directly back onto your carry. That being said, if you want your Gnar to be safer, I do recommend putting Gnar in the middle. If you have units on the outside like this, what'll happen is, you have units like this. What'll happen is Gnar will jump into the middle, the Corki will start hitting this Cassante first and kill it, and then the Corki can sometimes path onto this Cassante. I believe with this positioning right here, it's a 50-50, but you'd usually rather take a 50-50. That being said, you do want the Gnar to take a bit of damage because he is Mosher, and you usually are running like a Bloodthirster on him, so he's going to be able to heal up a bit of the damage, but you don't want him to be taking like the brunt of the focus fire, especially early on into the fight. So if you can prevent him from getting targeted by the enemy carry for as long as possible, that's going to be ideal. If you don't think your Gnar can actually jump onto the enemy carry, like they're clumping their front line, I actually recommend putting it opposite side of their carry. The reasoning for this is what's going to happen is, like, let's say they have like a lot of front lines sitting here, and Gnar might get stuck on the front line for a long time. If you jump over here, what's going to happen is the Corki will immediately just start targeting the Gnar, and he's just going to be stuck on the front line, and he's going to die before he's able to get to the enemy carry. That being said, if you go opposite side, your other units here, if you like position, some front line like this, the Corki's going to probably get through at least 2 of these frontliners here before targeting onto the Gnar, and your Gnar is just going to be safer. So if you don't think you can get back onto the enemy carry, just go opposite side of their carry to be safe, or you can just default into the middle. Next, we have Gragas. Now, I did kind of talk about this a bit earlier, but if you're running like a bruiser opener with Olaf and Tahm Kench, I usually will just have Olaf in the middle, Gragas and Tahm Kench on the outsides. Gragas does do a bit of AoE. He's going to chill enemies and I believe damage them as well at the end of his ultimate, and he's also going to heal during his ultimate. What this means is you don't want Gragas to immediately die as he starts ulting, because if he just starts ulting, he's not going to be able to get to the part where he chills and does the damage, and he's also not going to get the full value of his heal, because I believe it lasts like 3 seconds, his heal does. So you don't want the Gragas to die immediately, so you generally don't want the Gragas to be the first targeted unit, but you do want him to be targeted because you want him to have taken damage by the time he ults, that way he can heal himself up. You also want units around him. So if you're just gonna, have like a 1-star Gragas, I do recommend putting him in the middle so that way he can AoE around the units and apply that chill effect because it's relatively significant. That being said, if you have like a 2-star Gragas or a Gragas with items, definitely put him on the outside of your front line. That way units will walk around him, right? Because if my opponent has stuff around here, these Lillias like so, they'll walk around the Gragas and he'll be able to hit all of them, which is going to be pretty good. But obviously if the Gragas just dies immediately, it's not going to be very good. Whereas here he can at least hit 2 of the Lillias if he's in the middle like so. But if you're going to be defaulting it, I generally will just have the Gragas on the outside. But if it's like a Gragas 1, Olaf 2, Tahm Kench 2, a lot of times I may actually just put the Olaf 2 on the outside. Just unless the Olaf has the items, like damage items, then do the Olaf positioning I talked about earlier. If I'm playing a disco opener with my Gragas, I'll usually have my Gragas be the second unit hit after my Taric. Usually you want Taric to be the first one hit because that way he can apply the Guardian Shield and he's going to be a bit tankier, especially if you're sitting here with like Gragas 1, Taric 2. So I'll position something like this if I'm right side, and then I'll mirror like this if I'm left side. That being said, if you're sitting here with a Gragas 2 and you want to put items on the Gragas, definitely have your Gragas be the first unit hit because again, you want your tankiest unit to be the first one hit. Moving on, we have Jax. Now Jax, typically I would just default Jax to being in the middle of your front line. Like so. It's going to keep him nice and safe. He wants to take a bit of damage because he's a monster. He's going to be healing up. Again, a lot of times you run a healing item on him anyways, and you don't want him to have to walk up. So having him in the middle of front line is going to be good, and it's going to keep him relatively safe because no matter which corner your enemy carry is on, these Corkis, will both have to get through 2 of the Gnars in order to get to the Jax. Every time he ults, he jumps onto the highest health unit, so the likelihood he's ulting onto the enemy carry is pretty low anyways. So it's a bit harder to wrap around with a Jax, because a lot of times he'll just be like right here, and even if he's like going towards the Corki, he'll ult onto the highest health enemy, so he may just jump back to the front line anyways. So trying to wrap with Jax is a bit weird. You can try to wrap with Jax, but I think it's worse than other melee units due to the fact that he's always going to be ulting the highest health enemy within 2 hexes, so it's really hard to just guarantee that he's going to stay onto the enemy backline. So usually I just like to default having Jax in the middle of the board. Next, we have Kai'Sa. Now, Kai'Sa, every time she ults, can dash up to 2 hexes, which I believe is increased to 4 whenever she is a headliner. Now, interestingly, she can actually dash through units. So if I'm playing a Corki with my Kai'Sa and I have a Corki here, the Kai'Sa can actually dash to this hex right here. But if I have 2 Corkis like this, the Kai'Sa can't dash into these 2 Corkis right here. If you have 2 Corkis like this, or just any 2 backliners like this with the Kai'Sa, what she's going to do is actually ult front, which is pretty bad because it's going to make her very susceptible. You don't want the Kai'Sa to be ulting upwards. So a lot of our Kai'Sa positioning is going to be around preventing the Kai'Sa from ulting forwards. Another thing to note is that she tends to try and ult away from the enemy team. So for instance, let's say I have these Cassantes and I have them positioned over here, and the enemy's Tahm Kenches are over here. Now, the Kai'Sa is going to ult to a quote-unquote place of safety. Here, though, it's decently safe for her to ult upwards, so sometimes she will just randomly ult upwards. We don't want this because, again, we don't want the Kai'Sa to be going forwards because then she's going to be more likely to get hit by an enemy carry. Like, if there's something up here, it'll just target onto her Kai'Sa and kill her. What we'd rather do is position our Cassantes more so on the same side as our Kai'Sa. That way, ulting upwards isn't safe because she's close to this Tahm Kench here, and she'll instead ult to the side. Because ulting to the side is completely fine. You're still safe on the back row. Ulting upwards is bad. Again, make sure, though, that you don't put 2 units next to the Kai'Sa or else she's going to troll. Honestly, though, if you're carrying Kai'Sa, I would recommend just keeping her entire side of the board clear. Her AI is a little bit wonky, so I wouldn't really try and risk it and, like, guarantee that she's going to, like, go through this Corki or something. Or even if she like is the headliner, that she'll go through these Corkis right here. Sometimes she'll just troll. So I do recommend just putting your other backline units on the opposite side if Kai'Sa is your carry. If Kai'Sa isn't your carry, you can kind of just throw her wherever on the backline. Again, just try and have her focus fire with whatever your carry is. The positioning won't matter too much, even if she griefs herself, if she's not the carry, not the end of the world. But do make sure you give her some room to ult, even then, like especially in the mid game, because you don't want her to like die immediately for no reason. But I wouldn't sweat the positioning too much if she's not your carry. Next, we have Katarina. Now, typically with Katarina, you typically want the Katarina to be same side as the enemy carry if you're carrying the Katarina. This is because her ult is going to bounce 3 times, and so there's good likelihood that you can hit the enemy carry and actually kill them before they even get through your front line if you have Katarina on the same side. I typically like to have Katarina either on the second or third row like so. Make sure, this is extremely important with Katarina, to have your strongest tank in front of the Katarina directly. If you have positioning something like this, and you have an enemy carry in the back like so, if the Katarina is like here, what will happen is the Corki will kill the Olaf and then can actually just target it directly onto the Katarina and kill the Katarina. So you want to make sure that she's directly behind this Tahm Kench if the Tahm Kench is your strongest tank. Again, you want to be same side as the enemy carry, but I recommend positioning something like this. That way the strongest tank directly in front of the Katarina to keep her a bit safer. If your Katarina isn't your carry, you do want to note that she actually applies anti-heal with her ultimate. So just have Katarina near a unit that you want to apply the anti-heal to if they have a frontliner with some healing, or just whatever your carry is hitting. That way you can apply the anti-heal onto that unit and get that value right there. Next we have Kayle. Kayle positioning isn't that crazy if she's your carry. Usually you just throw her in one of the corners. If she's not your carry, she actually does apply Magic Shred on her ultimate. So you want to have her next to whatever AP carry you have. That way she can apply that Magic Shred and enable them to do a bit more damage. Next we have Pantheon. Pantheon's ult is going to be reducing damage taken to him and do damage to, I believe, the 3 units who dealt the most damage to him during his ult. What this means is you want Pantheon to be getting hit by at least 3 units whenever he's ulting. Otherwise, he's going to be losing out on a bit of damage that he could be. So you want to make sure that it's not just 1 or 2 units on the Pantheon. You want there to be at least 3 units on the Pantheon. Generally speaking, just having Pantheon on the outside is going to be ideal. So let's say, you just have other frontliners like this. Having the Pantheon something right here. That way units can clump around him, start hitting him. You don't necessarily just want him in like the corner like this, because then if the enemy has a bunch of frontline units, a lot of these might just go onto your other frontline units, or maybe only like one of them goes onto the Pantheon, and maybe only like 1 unit back here goes onto the Pantheon. So you typically ideally want the Pantheon to be a little bit closer to the center, but still on the outside because you want him to be getting hit first. Again, one of those is to apply the Guardian Shield. The other is if he's not getting hit, he doesn't have any value from his ultimate because it reduces damage and does damage to the units that hit him during the ult. Next, we have Senna. Now, if Senna isn't your carry, her positioning doesn't matter that much. Reason being, she doesn't really do that much with her ult besides do a bit of damage. So I would generally just have her near your carry if it's like the mid game, that way you can focus fire. And if it's late game, I'll just throw her somewhere so that way you can kind of spread the CC onto your team. But if you're carrying the Senna, her positioning is going to be decently important, at least in terms of how you position the other units on her team, because she's actually going to be doing an AoE around the unit she ults. She ults the unit that she's currently auto-attacking, and it's going to do an AoE around them, which is actually a pretty significant AoE if you have a headliner Senna. So you want to make sure you do is actually clump your frontline. Make sure your frontline units are close together. That way their frontline units will get close together. Again, if you're into a Senna, you want to spread out your frontline. That way she's not going to be able to AoE down on stuff. If you have a strong frontline unit, let's say this like Tahm Kench has a bunch of items, stuff like a stone plate, and it's going to be really tanky, you can even consider solo frontlining a unit. That way all the enemy frontliners, let's say it's these Cassantes here, if my enemy has a bunch of Cassantes like so, yeah, they'll like all, walk around this Tahm Kench, and the Senna should actually be able to hit all these guys with her AoE from her ultimate if she's the headliner version, and even if she's not the headliner version, you'll actually be able to hit multiple units too. Being able to solo frontline is quite nice with Senna. If I have like a Senna 3 with items and I'm carrying late game, I would actually try and just solo frontline one of my units to force a clump on the enemy frontline. I just throw your other frontline units in the back. So let's say I also have like these Olafs. I'll just throw him like third row like this. That way everything clumps around the Tahm Kench, and you can guarantee that you get some AoE damage onto them. Next we have Seraphine. Now in terms of where you position the Seraphine herself, it's not that significant, but how you position the rest of the units on the board is really impactful. Now if you're playing Seraphine, a lot of times you have KDA, so your positioning is going to be a bit restricted by the KDA hexes you have, but assuming we're not restricted by the KDA hexes, I'll go over how you're going to want to position. Now, Seraphine is going to be ulting the largest clump of enemy units, and if she hits units that are on your team with that, she'll also be healing them, and the ult has a 1 hex radius. What this means is that if you're playing Seraphine, you ideally want to be clumping your units. Reason for this is 1, your enemy frontline is going to be more likely to clump around, and Seraphine can damage them all, and 2, that way if your units are clumped together, it's more likely that her ult is going to hit multiple things, because if all your units are close together, once she ults an enemy frontliner, it'll be able to heal up multiple of your frontliners. If you're playing into a Seraphine, make sure that you don't clump your backline. As a note, let's say I'm playing into the Seraphine and these 2 Namis are my backline units. The Seraphine can still hit both these Namis here by just ulting into the middle of them, so make sure your units are at least 2 hexes away, so that way your Seraphine can't hit them. Let's say that the Nami here is your carry, and maybe you just have like these Jinxes here on your backline as well. I'd recommend positioning something more like this to keep your Nami safe. That way the Seraphine's never going to be ulting onto this Nami, because it'll either be ulting into this hex between these 2 Jinxes, or, you know, on one of these hexes to hit these 2 Jinxes right here. If you aren't able to fully spread out your front line, like if you can have, if you can't fully spread out your back line, like if you can have your back line spread out like this, they'll only be able to hit 1 unit at a time. But if you're not able to, I recommend clumping your front line. Now in a scenario like this, what you may want to do anyways, if you're the Nami player, is still just put like 2 of your frontline units like this. That way the Seraphine will guarantee to ult these 2 and not ult onto your carry. But if you know, have some clumping going on in the back line, you'd usually rather the Seraphine ult your front line because they're going to be tankier than your back line. She can just like kill the back line super easily. So I do recommend making a bit of a clump on the front line. If you clump 3 units like this, the Seraphine will always ult these guys, never the back line. So positioning like this is going to be extremely safe for the Nami. The Seraphine will first go for this 3 unit clump, then we'll go for the 2 unit clump back here, and then we'll finally go for the Nami. So you can be really safe for the Seraphine if you do something like so. Of course, as the Seraphine player, you want your units to be close together on the front line, that way you can clump around and you can hit multiple. You may think that like, oh, we want to spread it out, that way there's a higher chance you hit the backline, but I don't think it's worth it because Seraphine is going to be able to heal up, and you do want to just hit more units at once anyways, because it's going to be more damage output. Finally, we have Twitch. Twitch is going to be doing AoE around his target. I believe it's a 1 hex range, and then it also like does some splash. That's a 2 hex range afterwards that bounces around. So if you're Twitch, again, clump your front line together, because that way you want things to be close together so he can hit multiple of them. And if you're into the Twitch, again, just spread out your front line. If I'm playing into the Twitch like so, I can just put my front line something like this, and the Twitch is never going to be hitting 2 of them at once, and so it's going to be a lot safer. Even something like this is pretty solid. The Twitch player can do some things to try and force a clump. For instance, I can throw a Cassante right here, and there's a good chance this Tahm Kench walks to the left right here and hit, there's 2 units right here, and the Twitch can hit both of them. So if your enemy is positioned something like this, you can of course just put like a unit right here to force this. You don't want a unit right here if you're doing this, because then the Tahm Kenches will stay and you won't be able to have them clump around. And then of course, if your enemy front line is clumped together, you should be fine. You should always be able to just hit in a AoE. You may even want to put your Twitch in the middle if they're positioned like this. That way you hit in an even better AoE. That way you hit both Tahm Kench on the side. In general, for a unit that has a 1 hex radius on their ultimate, you can actually consider putting them in the middle if the enemy has a lot of frontline units in a row like so, because then you can hit on both sides as opposed to just one side. So the same concept applies to stuff like Corki. You'll be able to hit both sides. So moving on to the 3 costs, we first have Amumu. Now there's 2 scenarios where you're going to be playing Amumu. The first is going to be if he's your main tank, and the second is going to be if he's just a supplementary tank giving you traits. In the case where he's a supplementary tank giving you traits, he's not really ever going to get to his 3rd cast, so you don't need to worry about that. Generally speaking, I'll just throw my Amumu on the outsides. That way he gets targeted and stacks up a little bit of armor at the start of the fight, and is like decently tanky unit on the outside. And then of course, in general, with the Guardian units, we like them to be able to just proc their shield immediately. So if I don't have items on my Amumu, I'll just throw him onto the outside of my front line. Just that way, he will proc that Guardian shield as quickly as possible. If you have your tank items on Amumu, he will typically be getting to his 3rd cast, and on his 3rd cast, he's actually going to be CCing units within 2 hexes of him. What this means is that if you're just going to default your Amumu's positioning, just throw him into the middle. Reasoning for this, of course, is let's say my opponent has these Cassantes on the front line. In this scenario right here, and the Amumu's in the middle, like so, the Amumu will be hitting all of these Cassantes, but if I were to have my Amumu like over here, it'd only be hitting like these 3 Cassantes, not these guys on the other side. So just make sure that you have him in the middle. One thing that you can do if you get like an Amumu 3 with 3 items, solo frontlining him is actually quite good. He actually likes getting just hit by a lot of random different units, because every time he gets hit, he's going to be stacking armor. So if you just have a bunch of like random like tanks or support units that aren't doing much damage to him, it actually makes him tankier to get hit by them. And then everything will clump around him, and he'll be able to CC everything within this space. And he also actually does like a decent amount of damage on his ultimate anyways. So like a 3-star Amumu, you actually generally want to be solo frontlining. That way he can get the most value out of his ultimate. Next we have Ekko. Now Ekko is going to be crowd controlling in a circle around him. I believe it's 2 hex radius as well. So similar to Amumu, you generally just want the Ekko to be in the middle. Of course, Ekko will be crowd controlling on his 1st cast, so there's no reason to not have Ekko in the middle. So generally speaking, you want the Ekko to be in the middle or directly in front of whatever frontliner you may want to crowd control, or whatever carry they have on the front line. Again, if you have like a strong Ekko, 3-star Ekko with tank items, you can consider frontlining him. That way all the units will wrap around him, and he'll be able to crowd control a bunch of units at once. Next we have Lulu. There's 2 situations where you're going to be running Lulu. The first is going to be if you're using Lulu as a support unit, and the second is going to be if you're using Lulu as a carry. In this scenario where Lulu is a support unit, you want to be maximizing the ability to give hyper pop to 2 of your units. So the default way is, let's say I'm playing this Lulu here, and my 2 most important units are these Jinxes. Just throw your Lulu between these Jinxes. Of course, in this scenario right here, we are clumping our units, which does make us a bit more crowd control susceptible. So what you may want to do is position something more like this with the Lulu between these two Jinxes. If you just had like another unit in this bottom right corner, let's say this Corki, and then you had a bunch of frontline units, let's say these Tahm Kenches, the Lulu is going to be closest to these two Jinxes here because these are each 2 hexes away, whereas every other unit is at least 3 hexes away from the Lulu, so you're going to be able to give the hyper pop to them. If you moved this Jinx over here though, of course, the Lulu would potentially be giving one of the bonuses to a frontliner, which wouldn't be ideal. So yeah, you can just position and just have Lulu between these 2 units, and you should always be giving the bonus to this left Jinx and this right Jinx right here. If you're running Lulu as a carry, her positioning is going to be a bit different. So you can always just throw your Lulu in one of the back corners. It's never going to be a bad option. But the thing with Lulu's ultimate is on her first and second cast, she's going to be hitting a unit and then actually doing damage behind that unit. What this means is, let's say there's 2 Tahm Kenches here, like so. And let's say we had a Lulu just ulting directly forward into this Tahm Kench right here. It's not going to go, the ult is going to go behind the Tahm Kench and is not going to hit the second Tahm Kench. However, if, for instance, we were to have Lulu on the side of this Tahm Kench and ult this Tahm Kench, it'd go through and hit both. Now, obviously, having our Lulu on the side of a tank isn't feasible, but it demonstrates the property that we want to try and line things up. Your best bet, if you want to try and maximize the ability to hit 2 units with the ultimate, is to throw Lulu either in this hex or this hex, because you end up actually getting a better angle to hit the front line. Generally speaking, if you want to maximize your odds of hitting stuff, I'd recommend throwing a frontliner about right here. In this scenario right here, let's say this Tahm Kench walks over, you can a lot of times actually ult into this and hit both of these Tahm Kenches right here. And if there's 2 Tahm Kenches right here, there's still a good chance that your ult will actually go through multiple units if your Lulu is angled like this, or if you're angled like this, you're just less likely to hit units on the front row. This is just a general principle with the units that ult directly in a line. It's generally preferred to have them up in this hex or this hex right here, just because they get slightly better angles that way. Or even this hex, but this hex is kind of dangerous, so I try and stay clear from it. But this hex is usually preferred for units that just ult straight in a line. And yeah, I would always offset the front line slightly like this, because if you have the front line right here, it's very likely that units just walk over here or walk like this, and you're going to end up having a really bad angle. You'd much rather have the units walk around like this or like this, etc., because you're going to get a better angle for the Lulu ult. So next we have Lux. Now Lux is always going to ult in a line towards the farthest enemy unit. What this means is that if you're playing Lux, and let's say your opponent has this Corki as their carry, you're always going to want Lux on the opposite side of the Corki. That way the Lux can ult the Corki and kill it. What this means, of course, as the Corki player, is you want the Corki to be same size as the Lux, so you might want to move the Corki somewhere like right here. Of course, the Lux player can simply counteract that by just moving over to this right side. So if you want to be really safe from Lux, you can potentially move your carry somewhere to the middle like this. That way the Lux is going to spend time ulting in this left Jinx here, and then we'll go to the Corki. Of course, this isn't as safe as being same side as the Lux, but it's a bit less risky due to the fact that the Lux can't just move to counteract your positioning. You'll always have one unit in the corner to bait out the first Lux ultimate. In general, whenever you're playing versus Lux, make sure you spread out your backline. So backline like this is going to be really good because Lux is going to have to spend a single ult on every single unit, right? She can't hit any 2 of these units at once, so she's going to ult each of these one at a time. If you were to have like all your units clumped together like this, the Lux can hit a bunch of them all at once. So that's definitely something to keep in mind if you're playing like Disco into a Lux. Make sure you're not clumping all your units together, because the Lux is going to be able to hit a lot of stuff at once. In addition, another thing to note is I did say that you want your carry to generally be on the same side versus Lux if you're playing into a Lux. But if there's no corner bait on the top like left side in this scenario, the Lux is just going to ult into the Corki right here, and it's still going to kill the Corki. So make sure you have some corner bait on the opposite side. Again, ideally some bait in the middle too. This way you eat out 2 Lux ults if you know the Lux is going to be right side. And again, if you don't know, position something like so. And this should be relatively safe. One other unit that's extremely good into Lux is actually going to be a Lowy. If you're into Lux, what you can do is throw tentacles on the bottom left and bottom right corners like so. And these tentacles are going to be great because the Lux will ult this tentacle in the corner because it's never going to move. And then even if it kills the tentacle, your Lowy will a lot of times revive that tentacle with her ultimate. And so then the Lux basically has to spend 2 full ultimates on 1 tentacle that's not really doing that much. So it's just really powerful into Lux to have an Lowy in. If you know you're versus a Lux player, highly recommend taking in a Lowy, throwing the tentacles in both corners, and it's going to make your team a lot safer. As another note for Lux, there's actually a trick you can do if you have EDM active and you want to be using Lux's spell for the EDM, where you actually trap your Jax in the bottom right corner with a ranged unit here and here. These ranged units won't be able to move, assuming you just have like a frontliner right here, which is actually going to cause the Jax to be trapped, which will mean that he's going to be safe and not able to die. So whenever the Lux ult procs on the EDM, the Jax will actually be able to do the damage. So a lot of times you'll run like AP items on the Jax in this setup, and he'll actually be able to do a bunch of damage with the Lux ult. If you want to be safe, I think having the Lux and the Jax on opposite sides is pretty good because then they can hit opposite corners depending on where the enemy carry is. But another option is you can actually put the Lux and Jax on same side like this. That way they both target the same thing and burst stuff down. I think if you're sitting here with like a Lux 3 with items that can like one-shot units, I would recommend having them swapped like this. But if you're sitting here with like Lux 2 and you're not necessarily sure that she can one-shot stuff, it's probably better to double up. That way you can guarantee that you get a kill on the EDM ult proc, as opposed to, just leaving like 2 units at half HP. Next we have Misfortune. Misfortune is just going to ult the unit she's currently auto-attacking, and then will also do a bit of damage to the unit directly behind them. So what this means is that you do have potential to, spread onto the enemy carry, because it's the closest unit behind the unit you're hitting. So if you're same side as the enemy carry, you can potentially get the damage onto them. But I don't think it's that significant of a deal, because it usually doesn't spread that far onto the enemy carry. I don't generally see that, because especially in like late game, your opponent will have a lot of just frontline units, and it usually won't be killing that enemy carry with that extra spread. But the important thing with Misfortune positioning is to have her in front of a weaker unit. Misfortune is going to gain an attack speed bonus if she kills a unit with her ultimate. What this means is you don't want your Misfortune to immediately be attacking their tankiest unit, because she's not going to kill it quickly and won't be able to get that attack speed bonus. You'd rather have her in front of their weaker units, that way she can get some attack speed bonus earlier on in the fight and do a bit more damage quicker, and then get to the main tank later. So just try and have Misfortune on whatever side of the enemy frontline is weaker. Next we have Mordekaiser. Mordekaiser is going to do damage in a circle around him. I believe it's a 1 hex radius. So you generally want Mordekaiser to be on the outside of your frontline. So, just have him on the far right or the far left like so. That way the units on their frontline can all clump around the Mordekaiser. It might be more realistic to have it something like this. That way, if, they have frontline like this, the Mordekaiser can potentially have units clump around him. Like in this scenario, he'd be hitting 3 Tahm Kenches, versus in this scenario, he's simply just hitting 2 Tahm Kenches. So you just ideally put him on the outsides of your frontline. Again, if you have a strong Mordekaiser, especially like a Mordekaiser 3 with a bunch of items, solo frontlining him is actually quite good. Every single one of these frontline units will clump around the Mordekaiser, and he'll be able to damage all of them, and it's going to be pretty good. Next we have Neeko. Now whenever Neeko ults, she's going to shield herself and do damage in an AoE around her in a circle. Now of course Neeko is a Guardian, and as I've already discussed, we generally want Guardians to be on the outside. So if you're going to be defaulting your Neeko positioning, just throw her on the outside of your frontline. Again, outside of the frontline again is really good as well with a unit that has an AoE ult. That way, if your opponent's units are something like this and she's on the outside, they'll clump around her and she'll be able to hit more units than if she was in the middle in this scenario. In addition, if you have a strong Neeko with like a bunch of tank items, maybe 3-star, solo frontlining her is great as well, because she's going to be doing that AoE damage. Everything clumps around her and she'll be able to do that damage to all of them. And then of course, if she solo frontline, she's going to be the first unit taking damage. So she'll of course be able to apply that Guardian shield before any of your other frontliners die. Next we have Riven. Now Riven is of course a melee carry, and as I've discussed with melee carries, you generally want to have him on the second row here or here. That being said, in Riven's case, I actually prefer to have her on the front row. This is because Riven's ultimate gives her a shield, which is going to make her very, very tanky. So you actually want her to be taking a bit of damage, because she kind of functions as a secondary tank even when she's the carry. However, you generally don't want the Riven to be like directly on the outside of the front line, because you don't want her to just get bursted down immediately. So what you generally want to do is, let's say these Cassantes are other frontline units. You want the Riven to either be in this middle hex or these 2 hexes right here. She's an edgelord, of course, so she has the potential to just jump behind a unit and go onto the enemy carry. So if you think that you're able to jump behind a unit and go onto the enemy carry, maybe their front line's a bit more spread out, so it's very likely that you can just walk onto the back line, try and have Riven offset to the same side as their carry. So in this case, if the Corki's the carry, have her offset here. If you don't think you're going to be able to jump back onto the carry, like all this stuff is super clumped together in the front line, and it's going to be hard to walk back even if you edgelord proc, I recommend going opposite side as their carry. That way you don't just get immediately burst down. And if you want to be safe, you can just default into the middle, because this will always just generally be a relatively safe position for her. And that way she can take a bit of damage, but also deal that damage in the front line. Next we have Samira. Samira positioning really isn't that interesting. She's just a single target DPS unit, a background range carry, so generally just throw her wherever you think is going to be safest, and there's not much more to it. Next we have Sett. Sett is going to be hitting in a cone in front of him. Now with units that hit in a cone in front of them, you generally want to have them either on the far right or the far left of the front line. And here's why, and I'll demonstrate. Let's say these Tahm Kenches are the enemy's front line. Let's say I have my Sett right here in the middle of my board. If Sett is hitting in a cone, he's going to be facing one of these 2 Tahm Kenches. What's generally going to happen is he's going to hit in that cone, and it's going to hit like just 1 unit. But if Sett is on the side here, angling in, it's very likely you can hit 2 units, right? If the Tahm Kenches are right here, he might walk right here, and he can actually hit in this cone like so, and you generally just get a better angle on the side. So next we have Sett. Now Sett is going to be a frontline unit that hits in a cone. Now with frontline units whose ultimates hit in a cone, you generally want to have them either on the far right or the far left. So either here or here, generally just whatever side you need to be protecting. Now the reasoning for this is because if you have them on the far right or the far left, the likelihood that they angle their ult correctly is significantly higher. In this scenario here, if I have my Sett in the middle, he's generally just going to be facing either this Tahm Kench here or this Tahm Kench here, and he's going to hit in a cone and it's just going to only hit like one unit. Then once he kills one of them, he's going to just target onto the other one, and again, he's only going to be hitting one unit. Not that great. However, if you throw your Sett on the far right, what's very likely to happen is the Sett will walk up like this, and he'll hit in a cone and actually hit multiple units right here. Or if he's here, it's very likely he walks like this and hits in a cone. Even if he like walks like this and doesn't, walk exactly how we want it to, because it should be a 50-50 between walking this way and walking this way. Of course, if you have a unit body blocking here, let's say it's the Olaf on our team. If we throw it right here, the Sett will always walk up like this. So he's going to be much more likely to hit in a cone if you can position like this. But even if you don't do that, a lot of times what can happen here is you have the Sett right here, you kill the Tahm Kench, and then again, it's another 50-50, he can walk up like this. So you won't always be able to guarantee that you get everything in a cone. Again, the best way is to have all your units body block on the same side. That does have some positioning disadvantages because you are kind of clumping everything to one side. Generally, when you're clumping your front line, you don't want it to be directly in front of the carry, because if you clump all of your front line directly in front of the carry, your entire team is going to be super CC susceptible. If your enemy has like any AoE CC, it's just going to hit everything on your team. So generally when you're clumping your front line, you want it to be in the middle instead of in the corner. But if you do that positioning, your Sett is more likely to walk up and hit in a cone. But even if you don't, just throwing him in the far right or far left is going to give you the highest likelihood of him walking up and hitting these in a cone. He also does have potential to like walk onto the carry and actually do some damage onto the carry as well. Next we have Urgot. Now with Urgot positioning, if you're running him as a carry, you generally just want to have him on the second row behind whatever your strongest frontliner is. You actually don't really need to worry too much about Urgot taking damage because he's actually really tanky with his shield. So I would generally just throw him directly behind my strongest frontliner. Ideally offset to the same side as the enemy carry, but it doesn't really matter too much. You want him to be more so in the middle though, because he actually hits in a cone. So you don't want your Urgot to just be like off to the side, having fun. Like if your Urgot's over here, he's going to be hitting less than if he's right here. Here he should be cone hitting these 3 Tahm Kenches, whereas here he's only going to cone hit these 2 Tahm Kenches. So generally just have him either in one of these 3 middle hexes, just to maximize the likelihood that he's hitting properly in a cone. And if Urgot isn't your carry, you can actually front row your Urgot. He's pretty tanky with his shield again. So just a front row Urgot 2 is actually decently tanky come late game. Of course, you can still second row him even if he's not your carry, but first rowing him is actually very acceptable if he's not the carry. Next we have Vex. Vex is going to provide CC in a 1 hex radius around her target, and is also going to be doing damage in a 1 hex radius around her target. So like I've discussed earlier with units that have a similar 1 hex radius on their ultimate, you generally want to have your frontline more clumped together. Don't have your frontline units spread out. So again, spreading your Cassantes like this is going to be worse. Clumping them together like this is going to raise the likelihood that she'll actually be able to get AoE onto them. But what's most ideal is to be able to solo frontline a unit. So this is where we kind of see the Amumu plus Vex synergy. Vex can be sitting here alone. Amumu can be sitting here alone on the front line. Everything on their team is going to clump around this Amumu. So again, let's say it's these Cassantes. They'll all walk around this Amumu. The Vex will hit them, do AoE with their ultimate onto them. Amumu will do AoE with his ultimate onto them. And so it's just a really good combo to have this solo frontline Amumu plus Vex as a backline carry. Finally, for the 3 cost, we have Yone. Now, if you're playing Yone as a carry, he's just going to be your standard edgelord positioning for a melee carry. Just all the stuff I talked about with Yasuo, generally on this right hex or left hex, generally on the same side as the enemy carry, so that way you can potentially edgelord proc into it. If Yone isn't your carry, you want to have him on the front row, opposite side is their carry. Again, this is because he's a crowd diver, so if this Annie is the carry, just have Yone over here, that way he crowd divers onto this Annie. And again, if Annie is over here, have Yone here, that way he crowd divers onto the Annie. You generally want him to be on the outside, so that way he can crowd diver pop really early into the fight and get that CC earlier, because again, earlier on CC is generally better than later on CC. Moving on to the 4 cost, we first have Ahri. Now, Ahri actually has a good bit of nuance with her positioning. A lot of times, though, you are going to be forced to put her in a KDA hex because you'll be running KDA, so just put her in whatever KDA hex makes sense in that situation. But assuming you're not restricted into a certain hex, I'll go over how we want to think about Ahri's positioning. So there's 2 ways we can think about Ahri's positioning. The first is going to be if she has blue buff, and the second is going to be if she doesn't have blue buff. I'll start off by talking about blue buff, and really you want to categorize the enemy's frontliners into 3 different frontliners. Either their super tanky frontliner with like their 2-star unit with the items, a mid-tier frontliner that's like usually upgraded and does a decent amount of work. That's going to be something like an Ekko or like a Thresh with no items. And then weak frontliners that don't really do much, that's going to be like bad units like Garen, or stuff like a target dummy, or just like a random, like 1-star Amumu or something that they're just running on their frontline. It's going to be that stuff. Now, if you're running blue buff on Ahri, you actually want to first target the weak frontliner, because you'll be able to get the damage amp bonus from the blue buff by killing that unit and then moving on to the other units. After that, you'd ideally like to be able to hit the mid-tier frontliners afterwards, because you should be able to kill them pretty quickly and prevent them from doing work. Something like Ekko can actually do a decent amount of work if left unchecked, so you want to be able to kill it quickly to prevent it from doing work. And then you'd want to kill the main tank last once you've cleared off the rest of the front line, because it'll take the longest to kill. Now, this is going to be if you have blue buff. If you don't have blue buff, what you actually want to do is kill the mid-tier frontliners first, then the main tank, and then the weak frontliners. The reason for this is like the weak frontliners against stuff like a training dummy or a Garen isn't going to be doing that much, so it's not high priority to kill them early on to the fight, and because Ahri is single target damage, they're just going to be eating a free ult or two off your Ahri, mitigating her damage onto actually useful targets. One other thing to note is that Ahri does actually have a brief stun whenever she ults. It's not super significant, but it is nice, and of course if your enemy has a melee carry, try and get your Ahri in front of that melee carry, because she can usually just burst it down before it's able to get to the backline, especially with the stun from it. It's going to be quite effective. So next we have KDA Akali. Now KDA Akali is going to ult towards the farthest unit, marking them, and then every ult afterwards is going to do damage to every marked unit and will also deal damage to every unit that's in a line. So make sure your units aren't like in a line if you're versus Akali, because then she'll be able to do a bit of bonus damage to all your units. And as playing as an Akali, what you want to do is typically throw her either on the second or the first row. If she has a bunch of healing, you can just throw her on the first row. If she doesn't, I recommend the second row, opposite side the enemy carry. So in this case, say the Corki is the enemy carry. You'd want the Akali in one of these hexes right here. So that way she's going to ult towards this Corki, marking it and doing a bunch of damage. If you're the Corki player, however, what you're going to want to do is put corner bait to protect the Corki. That way if Akali ults this way, she'll hit this Jinx here. And then after the Jinx, she'll typically reset onto the front line. So let's say the front line's like this. She's going to ult over to the Jinx, and then next ult will go back to this Cassante here, and then she'll go back to this corner, which means if this Jinx dies, she'll actually be going back to the Corki. So ideally speaking, what you'd like to do is have your carry be in the middle, because in this situation, she'll jump onto this Jinx, jump over onto this Cassante, then jump over onto this Jinx, probably jump back onto this front line right here, or if the front line unit here is dead, she'll jump over to this Jinx right here, maybe jump back to this Cassante. And as you see with the way she's jumping around, she's just never going to jump onto this middled unit right here. So middling your carry is always going to be the safest, because they'll basically never get marked by the Akali. Of course, you won't always have the freedom to middle your unit, but I do highly recommend putting one unit in each of the corners versus Akali, because then she's going to be very likely to jump onto those cornered units as opposed to your carry. Next, we have True Damage Akali. Now, True Damage Akali is just a melee carry, so all the stuff I talked about with a melee carry still exists. You typically just throw it on the second row, either one of these edge hexes right here. She hits the 3 closest enemies, so you do want to make sure that your True Damage Akali is always on the same side as the enemy carry, because there's a really high likelihood that her daggers bounce onto the enemy carry because she throws 3 of them. So again, if you're hugging this side right here, and there's like this Corki right here, and your enemy front line is positioned like this, what'll happen here is this Akali will hit this Cassante, and the Corki like so. So what this means is that if you're into an Akali, you want to make sure that you have 3 frontliners close like this. That way they will all go onto these Cassantes as opposed to going onto this Corki, just to keep your carry a bit safer. Next we have Blitzcrank. Blitzcrank positioning doesn't matter too much. If Blitzcrank is your main tank, you generally want him to be taking damage first. Like I've talked about, you generally want your main tank to be damaged first. But realistically, you don't need to worry too much about Blitzcrank positioning. He'll basically always ult at 2-star even if he's on the outside, so you don't have to worry about him potentially not ulting. And it doesn't really matter whether he's on the outside or the inside. He's going to be doing the same amount of damage, because he does this pulse effect, but it only affects one nearby unit anyways, and he's always going to be near a unit. So you don't really lose any damage off of positioning him incorrectly. So you can kind of just throw Blitzcrank wherever makes sense for your board. So next we have Caitlyn. Now Caitlyn is actually going to ult towards the 4 farthest enemies, and will actually get her ult blocked by units that are in between her. So for instance, let's say you have the Caitlyn here and the enemy's Corki carry is over here. What the Corki player is going to want to do is make sure they have at least one unit between the Caitlyn and the Corki. That way if the Caitlyn fires towards the Corki, it'll get blocked by this Cassante. Again, I do recommend having a couple units in the middle of the board like this, just to make it a lot less likely that the Caitlyn can get the proper angle. Because for instance, if the Caitlyn were to move right here and you don't have this right Cassante, the Caitlyn gets a clean angle onto the Corki. So having another Cassante here makes it a lot less likely that the Caitlyn can go onto the Corki. Now, that being said, if the Caitlyn moves over here and you don't have enough backline bait, let's say you just have these 3 Jinxes as your additional backline bait. In this case, the Caitlyn will fire onto the 3 Jinxes and the Corki, and will actually have proper line of sight onto the Corki. So in the case where you only have 4 backliners versus a Caitlyn, I do recommend having another unit in front like so. This way, no matter where the Caitlyn is, she can't actually get a proper line of sight onto the Corki, because if this Cassante is sitting right here, it'll actually body block for the Corki. And then, of course, these will all body block for the Jinx. And then the Cassantes will all body block for this Corki here if Caitlyn is in any of these hexes like so. The Caitlyn player can kind of deal with this by just offsetting their front line a little bit. So you throw the front line like over here, and then the Cassante might walk right here and actually open up the line of sight for the Corki player. Not really that much the Corki player can do, but in this situation, the best play would actually be to move the Corki over right here. So if you want the Corki to be super safe from the Caitlyn, I actually recommend positioning something more like this. And the reasoning for this here is basically none of the hexes back here will Caitlyn ever get a proper line of sight onto the Corki. Again, the Caitlyn player could like theoretically do something like this and try and like drag everything down like this to try and get a really good line of sight onto the Corki, but this obviously opens the Caitlyn player up to like being really susceptible because now your front line is all completely offset and stuff can kind of just walk onto the Caitlyn. So you should never really be doing this as the Caitlyn player. You should always have your units at least this far over. And at this point, it's going to be really easy for your opponent to, body block for the Corki. So just keep that in mind. Of course, if you are the Corki player and you actually have 5 units on your backline and only 3 units on your front line, simply all you'll have to do is position something like so. And in this scenario, the Corki should be completely safe from the Caitlyn, because even if the Caitlyn is on like the left or the middle, the Cassante should be able to body block for the Corki. And if she's on the right side, she'll actually be targeting towards the Jinxes, not the Corki. So this positioning here is also safe for the Corki against the Caitlyn. So next we have Ezreal. Now Ezreal positioning is a little bit weird because he kind of just jumps around anyways. So, where you're positioning him doesn't matter that much because he's going to move around the board. My biggest recommendation, though, if you're playing Ezreal, is don't put a bunch of units next to him. If you put a bunch of units next to him, he's going to be very likely to just blink upwards whenever he ults and kind of just walk into the enemy team and be super susceptible. So I would recommend trying to offset your backline to be opposite your Ezreal. That way you can give him at least a little bit of room to run around on his own and not grief by running up into the front. As well, every third ult, he ults in a line. So if you're playing into the Ezreal player, make sure you don't have your units all on a line. Like, let's say these Jinxes are all the player versus the Ezreal. And, they have their Jinxes like so. This is obviously really bad positioning into Ezreal because Ezreal can get right here and then just ult them all in the line. Again, this would be something that like a Disco player would have to watch out for because positioning like this is somewhat common with Disco. You don't position usually like this if you're not playing Disco, but it's pretty common in that board. So definitely keep that in mind versus Ezreal, that he'll be able to just hit in a giant wave and hit all these units. So your best bet here is just to break stuff up, kind of, offset things around your board like so. That way he can't get some super crazy ult right here. He can like at most ult 3 units, and you can even mix things up a bit more like this. And now he's at most going to be ulting like 2 units. So just spreading out your units versus Ezreal is going to be ideal because then he's not going to be getting as good of an ult. The more spread things out are, the better you'll be. Next we have Karthus. Karthus positioning really doesn't matter that much. He just always ults the 5 lowest health units. So just position Karthus wherever you think he's going to be safest. And that's basically all there is to it. Next we have Poppy. Now Poppy kind of has 2 ways you can think about positioning her. The first is if you want her to go onto the enemy carry. Again, let's say the Corki's the enemy carry here. You can position her same side as the enemy carry. I usually would have another unit on the outside of the Poppy like this, so she's not the first one targeted. She does want to be first row though because she's Mosher and you want to be able to heal back up. And, you want to be able to take a bit of damage for the Mosher trait. So you'd want it to be like same side as the Corki, but not the first one getting hit. That way she has high potential to walk back onto it. You could even position something like this. Usually the Tahm Kench will get hit first here. You do need to be cautious though, because sometimes people will move their carry over 1 hex and put corner bait here. Here it would be immediately hitting the Poppy, which is a little bit suspicious because sometimes the Poppy might get bursted. So something like this is a little safer, but you're less likely for the Poppy to be able to make it onto the enemy carry. The other way to think about it is if Poppy gets a kill with her ultimate, she actually is going to hammer down 1 extra time. So another way you can position your Poppy is actually just position her in front of whatever the enemy's weakest frontliner is. That when she ults, she'll almost guarantee a kill onto that weakest frontliner, and she'll actually be able to just get another hammer off, which, just getting a little bit of extra damage is always going to be a nice thing. So do recommend having Poppy in front of the weaker side of the front line if possible. That way she can get those resets and do extra damage. Next we have Thresh. Thresh is going to ult the largest clump near him. What this means is that if you're into a Thresh player, what you want to do is kind of declump your carry away from your other units. So let's say I'm playing with the Corki as my carry and Jinx as these other backline units. If I position my units in a clump like this, the Thresh is just going to be able to ult into all these guys and hit everything. However, if you're the Corki player, what you can simply do is just offset like this, and the Thresh is basically never going to ult onto the Corki, because he's either going to ult onto like this group of Tahm Kenches, or even if he's like here, he might ult onto this group of Tahm Kenches plus the Jinxes. As a general good way to think about it though, you do want to just spread out your units. If you're spread out like this, or realistically more like this, the Thresh won't be able to get a crazy good ult. That being said, if the Thresh is right here, it's very likely that he ult onto this Corki and this Jinx. So if you're the Corki player, I would recommend doing something more like this. Just that way, it's going to be less likely to hit onto the Corki. You know, something like this, the Corki should be very, very safe. So be a little cognizant of being too spread out, because if you're too spread out, you're not baiting the Thresh into ulting your largest clump. You want to make sure that you have a clump on your board that is larger than the one that is next to your carry. That way the Thresh will never ult into that carry. As the Thresh player, of course, you generally just want to have your Thresh in front of whatever carry they have. That way you have the highest chance of being able to CC it. With Thresh, I actually don't like him on the outside usually. His cast animation is kind of long, and I find when I have my Thresh on the outside of my front line, he just dies before he can actually get through the full cast animation, which is definitely not ideal. I really like him on like the second unit right here or the second unit right here. These are my two favorite hexes for Thresh, because if they have a top left carry, I have him here. Top right carry, have him here. And he's generally going to be safe enough to be able to get an ult off and actually CC it. Of course, if you have a 3-item Thresh, you can actually just throw the Thresh on the outside, because he'll definitely live long enough to cast once. Usually a 3-item Thresh lives long enough to cast twice anyways, so you can just throw a 3-item Thresh on the outside, no problems there. So next we have Twisted Fate. Now Twisted Fate is going to be throwing cards at his current target, as well as the 3 closest enemies. He's also going to be providing Magic Shred on his ult. So if Twisted Fate isn't your carry, you want to make sure that he's on the same side as whatever AP carry you have. Let's say it's like Ahri. You want to have him like next to your Ahri. That way he can provide Magic Shred to the units that the Ahri is hitting and buff up her damage. In addition, if you have Dazzler in, which you usually will with Twisted Fate, you ideally want to have him on the same side as the enemy carry, even if he doesn't have items. That way, if he potentially throws the card onto the backline, because again, it's very reasonable that he throws the card onto the backline. If your opponent's front line is positioned like this, you know, just something like this, and then has a carry back here, and you have your Twisted Fate right here, it's going to ult these 3 Tahm Kenches and the Corki, and we'll be able to apply that Dazzler debuff onto the Corki, lowering its damage. And then, of course, if the Twisted Fate is your carry, you want to be same side as the enemy carry ideally. That way, you can, of course, potentially just kill it. A lot of times, Twisted Fate can just kill the carry before the carry can even like get through the front line, because he'll just like proc a bunch of cards onto it early on into the fight, and you just win the fight for free. Twisted Fate, you'll also typically position around your disco ball. I'll talk about how to position disco balls at the end of the video. So if you want to see how you position around that, just go to that part. Next we have Viego. Viego is going to ult in the nearby clump, and he's going to apply a damage amp onto the units he hits. The units he hits, your whole team's going to be doing 10% more damage. So if Viego isn't your carry, you just want Viego to be on same side as your carry. That's basically all you need to worry about. That way he can ult the same stuff, right? Again, if this Corki is my carry here, I don't want him to be on the opposite side of the Viego, because if the Viego applies the damage amp onto the units on the right side, the Corki's not hitting them. We need them to be the same side so we can apply the damage amp. If Viego is your carry, I do recommend having him on same side as the enemy carry. It's very common for Viego to just like jump into the middle of the enemy board. Again, let's say your opponent has like these Tahm Kenches right here, and they have like this Corki right here. They have like, you know, maybe some more frontline like this, and then just another backline unit right here. It's very common for the Viego to just decide to like jump right here, and he'll start hitting this stuff, and then it's very common he like jumps onto or walks onto the enemy carry and can kill it and do a bunch of damage. So I do recommend, if you're carrying a Viego too, to put same side as enemy carry, because it's very likely that he just walks onto them. Again, if you're playing into a Viego, make sure that your front line isn't in a way that you're kind of leading the Viego to jump onto it. I wouldn't recommend clumping units in your backline versus Viego, because then he's going to be, you know, wanting to jump onto those units. You're going to have a much better time if your carry is a bit more isolated. That way, the Viego is always going to be jumping onto the front line. So an ideal positioning would be something like having the Corki like this, you know, front line all clumped together, Corki back here, and just whatever other carries on the, whatever backline units on the other side. It's still possible the Viego goes into the Corki, but it's going to be less likely. Next, we have Zac. With Zac, he's going to bounce onto 3 different units and CC them. It's going to be 3 nearby units. What this means is you ideally want Zac to be on same side as the enemy carry. That way, you know, he can potentially jump onto that carry and crowd control it. Typically, I like Zac to not be on my outside, because again, his cast animation is kind of long, similar to Thresh, that if he's taking the damage initially, he won't usually get through the entire cast. So I do recommend putting him in either one of these hexes right here. That way he's going to live through his entire cast animation, get that healing, get those CC onto all those units. And again, same side as their carry, that way it's going to be likely that you get onto it. You can even position something like this. This is pretty solid. Have Zac either here or here with another unit on the outside. This is going to be even more likely to go on their carry than if you had him in one of these 2 hexes right here. Finally, we have Zed. Zed is just your melee carry that we've talked a bunch about. Generally just want him on the second row, either right side or left side. Again, ideally, usually just same side as enemy carry. That way he can walk onto them potentially. But if they have a really strong front line, you want him to be opposite side of the enemy carry. That way he's not just going to get bursted down. So again, weak front line, same side enemy carry, strong front line, opposite side enemy carry. Moving on to the 5 cost, we first have Alawi. Now typically with Alawi, what you're going to want to do is just have Alawi be somewhere in the middle of the board. Where she is doesn't really matter that much, with the tentacles on either side of your front line. And the reason for this is you want the tentacles to actually be the first units hit from the enemy team. Their main purpose generally is just going to be a meat shield for your team. They do like a decent amount of damage, but they're usually worse than just like a normal unit. So you'd rather them just die first. And then of course, whenever your Alawi ults, she'll actually revive one of her tentacles. So you want one of the tentacles to die before the Alawi ults. So you always want one of these to be the first one hit. The one exception for putting the tentacles on the front row is if the opponent has like some sort of backline access, like something like a Lux that wants to hit the corner or an Akali that wants to hit the corner, which I talked about on those units. In that case, you can actually backline the tentacles like this. That way they kind of just serve as like corner bait again versus like the KDA Akali or versus the Lux. In some scenarios, if you have like an Alawi 2 with like tank items and you're like kind of using her as like a secondary carry, you can consider putting the tentacles more on like the second row like this. In this scenario here, or even like the third row like this. In this scenario here, they'll be able to actually output a decent amount of damage. But I would only do this if I have like a 3-item Alawi 2 and I actually like actively want to use the damage from the tentacles. If I'm playing a board where I have like tons of backline damage anyways, like I have like a Lucian, Jhin, etc., I'm going to care more about the front line, and we'll still just frontline the tentacles in that scenario. Next, we have Jhin. Now, Jhin is a ramping champion, which, as I've discussed earlier, typically means you want him to be opposite side of the enemy carry. But in Jin's case, you actually want him to be same side as the enemy carry. Now, the reasoning for this is that Jhin is actually going to be an infinite range unit once he starts his conducting. So make sure that you, of course, have at least 4 slots on your bench, and after he makes 4 of his violins, he's actually going to stop moving and stop auto-attacking. So he'll just kind of sit there. So you generally want to have your Jhin just be in one of the corners safe, but ideally same side as the enemy carry. Because he's going to have infinite range, he'll actually pretty much always hit the backline enemy carry before they get to him. Like let's say the front lines die, and they both want to start autoing each other. This carry will have to walk up to start hitting the Jhin, but the Jhin will just be able to hit this backline unit before it can even walk up, meaning he'll pretty much always win a 1v1 versus the enemy carry, because he doesn't have to walk and they don't have to. Next we have Kayn. Kayn will typically just be positioned on the second row. One of these sides is generally what you're going to want to do. Ideally on same side as their carry, that way he can potentially walk back onto the carry and apply the chill effect onto them. That being said, if your opponent has a isolated frontliner, like let's say for some reason they have like 3 frontliners over here and a frontliner right here, you're actually going to want to make sure that you have the Kayn in front of this isolated frontliner. That way he can like spin around it a couple times, because if he does his ult onto a unit that is isolated, he'll actually immediately ult again. So isolated units versus Kayn are really bad. If you see your enemy has a Kayn, especially a Kayn with like multiple items, you want to make sure that none of your units are isolated, so clump together that front line. This is actually the scenario where you don't want your carry to be isolated. So let's say you have this Caitlyn and this Corki in the back right here versus the Kayn, or let's say like it's on my board. I actually am going to want to put them next to each other as opposed to spread apart. Because if they're spread apart and the Kayn gets right here, he's just going to start ulting onto this Caitlyn and kill her. Whereas if they're like this, he's going to ult right here and actually hit both and stop ulting. Of course, he's still going to be on the Caitlyn applying that chill effect, lowering her damage output and doing damage to her. But this is actually safer than having your carry isolated. So don't isolate your carry versus Kayn. And in general, don't isolate any of your units. Make sure something is always next to them. That way the Kayn can't just like start chaining casts. Next we have Lucian. Now Lucian is always going to ult towards the farthest enemy, and he's pretty bad at like repositioning his angle while he's ulting. So you want to make sure that your Lucian is opposite side the enemy carry. That way he can potentially start hitting it and snipe them. Because if he's same side as the enemy carry, a lot of times he'll just like never go onto it during the fight. If you're versus a Lucian, you want to make sure that you have stuff blocking your front line. Similar to what I was talking about with Caitlyn, if this Corki's the carry right here, what I want to do is have these Cassantes right here. And then ideally want to have some bait on the other side like this. In this scenario right here, if the Lucian's on this side, he'll ult towards the Corki, and the Cassantes will take the damage, and if he's on this side, he'll ult towards the Jinx, and the Cassantes will take the damage right here. Of course, if we just had the Jinx over here, he'd actually ult towards the Corki and actually be able to do damage to it. If you're playing as the Lucian player, I highly recommend leaving a bit of room for the Lucian to dash around. That way he can potentially get a better angle while he's ulting. So I usually won't put any units next to him if he's, going to be my primary carry. So I'd usually just have like my other units, something like this, to give that Lucian a bit of room. You always want to give him like at least 1 hex of room. Something like this is acceptable. I usually prefer giving him like 2 extra hexes of room. But yeah, make sure you don't like put something next to him if he's going to be your carry. Don't trap him like this, because you want him to be able to dash around and get good angles. Next we have Qiyana. Now Qiyana Generally, you're going to be running her with the true damage bling bonus, which means whenever she kills a unit, she's going to be able to give you a free item component. So generally, you just want Qiyana to be in front of whatever enemy tank has items. That way, in case she gets a kill onto them, she can actually just generate you a new component. So I'll generally just recommend throwing Qiyana in front of whatever tank has items on it, typically just second row. Again, I've talked about how on second row, you want to usually be right or left, but if their tank is like in the middle, you can do something like put your tanks like this. And in this scenario right here, the Qiyana will always walk into the middle. That way she's never going to be targeted first because the stuff is going to hit these frontline Cassantes. Like you throw the Qiyana here or here, everything will start hitting these Cassantes, and then she'll walk into this hex. So if your opponent has like their tank with items right here, let's say it's like this Lillia, that way the Qiyana can walk into this hex, start hitting it, potentially get the kill, and give you a free item component. Next we have Sona. Sona positioning basically doesn't really matter. Her ult hits like the entire board, and she just, autos onto your allies anyways, so I wouldn't worry too much about how you're positioning your Sona. Just put her wherever she's going to be safe. Next we have Yorick. I like to have Yorick in the middle of my board. The thing with Yorick is you want him to always be able to get to 2 casts. Once he gets to 2 casts, he creates his big ghoul, which is going to be really good. It does a good amount of damage and has a lot of HP. The big ghoul is what makes Yorick really, really good because it provides a lot of extra frontline. So I typically like to have Yorick in the middle of the board. Again, I've talked about how with Guardians, you do usually want them on the outside, but Yorick is kind of one of the exceptions here. You'd prefer him in the middle to guarantee that he's going to live longer, because middle units typically live longer. That way he can get to those 2 casts. Finally, for the 5 cost, we have Ziggs. Ziggs is going to be throwing bombs, and it's going to explode and go onto a bunch of nearby enemies. And you'll typically be running him with Dazzler, which means you usually want him to be same side as enemy carry. That way he can apply that Dazzler effect onto that unit, and then potentially even kill them. If he ults them multiple times, the Ziggs will ramp up damage because he throws more bombs per ult, and so he'll a lot of times be able to just throw multiple bombs onto the enemy carry throughout the fight and kill them. But even if your Ziggs is like sitting here just like as a Ziggs one with no damage items, you want him to be same side as enemy carry. Again, that way he can apply that Dazzler effect potentially, because his bombs will a lot of times splash onto the enemy backline. You don't have to be like directly in front of the enemy carry. If you just have your Ziggs like offset in the middle like this should be fine. If you have your like Ziggs right here, it's not going to be likely it hits this Corki right here. But even like this hex, it's very likely you hit the Corki, even if they have multiple frontline units. Finally, I'd like to talk about Disco. In the early game, what I like to do with my standard Disco opener when I have 4 or 5 units is usually just position on the right side like so. You can position left side, but I usually prefer the right side when I just have like 4 or 5 units. But once you get to 6 units, you need to make sure that you move the Disco over to the left side. That way you can actually give the Disco bonus to all your units. Again, the positioning here isn't really too crazy. It's going to be nice to have it on the left side here. You're going to just want to put ranged units in this hex, and this hex, and melee units in this hex, and this hex. If you have 4 melee units, there's a bit of a decision making that you have to do. If you put a melee unit like so, like let's say this Kennen is like a melee unit as well, in a scenario like this, it's actually possible that this Tahm Kench behind gets trapped if like an enemy frontliner is like right here and actually walks up first, because it'll be a 50-50 as to which team starts walking first. So if your team starts walking first, this Tahm Kench will walk up, and then this guy can walk up, and you're completely fine. But if their guy walks down first like this Tahm Kench will sit here, and you can accidentally trap your tank like this, which isn't going to be ideal. But it's usually okay. If you want to make it a bit safer, you can position like this. In this case, this Tahm Kench will always be able to walk around, and you're never going to have the issue of your frontline units getting trapped. But you're a little more susceptible, like having a ranged unit here is less preferable to having a ranged unit right here. So just keep that in mind. That being said, you usually will have like 3 ranged units and 2 melee units, especially if you're running like something like a Kennen. You can just throw the Kennen here, and it'll always be fine. But simply just keep that in mind. And yeah, you always want to be left side once you have 6 units with your Disco Ball. Then in the late game, you generally want to be positioning something like this if you're playing with the 5 Disco and you have the 2 balls like so. With this positioning here, we essentially just give our ranged units to this back Disco Ball, and we give the Disco Ball to the front units with this middle Disco Ball. You can theoretically do the Disco Ball something like in this hex right here. I've seen people do it like this. My problem with this is you're a little more clumped together, which makes you a little more susceptible, especially to stuff like a Lux ult that hits in a line. So I do prefer something like this, that way you've kind of spread stuff out a little bit more, and it'll feel a little bit safer for units back here. Right side, generally, I don't recommend, because if you have 3 backline units, like where do you put the Lulu? You can put her here, but this isn't that safe of a hex. Whereas here, if you go left side, all 3 of these hexes for the Twisted Fate, Nami, and Lulu are quite safe. So this ends up actually, working out decently fine. If you do only have 2 backline units, though, you can definitely consider throwing the Disco Ball right side, but I generally prefer it to be left side here. And if you have 4 backline units, a lot of times I'll actually just sack like the Nami. So let's say like I'm playing like the Ahri with the Lulu and the Twisted Fate, or maybe I'm playing like a Ziggs with them. I'll just position something like this. That way I'm giving it to these guys, and I'll just throw the Nami over here. You can theoretically like throw it in this spot, This is fine as well. But like the Nami doesn't really care that much about the disco value. She's not that great of a unit. So I usually just throw over here to kind of declump a bit for my board. If you made it to the end, I want to thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and to subscribe to the channel. In addition, within a day or two, I will be releasing a video covering every single comp in Set 10, so make sure to keep your eyes peeled for that, as it's going to be a long video with a lot of good information. And so yeah, hope you guys are looking forward to that.